Hi, class. Welcome back to this breakdown by chapter of the American Yawp textbook, Volume 2. Now, World War II is behind us, but we're not quite done with the legacy of that. The legacy of World War II will carry us pretty much through the rest of this course. But one of the first things that comes about as a result of that war will be the Cold War. It's a deeply intense political military and ideological rivalry that's going to break out between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's going to shape global affairs for decades, well into the end of the 1900s, the end of the 20th century. Now, this chapter is going to explore causes, early confrontations, and the impact of this global standoff. And again, it's going to define pretty much everything. It's going to have its claws in everything. Now, the origin of the Cold War can be traced back to the end of World War II. And while the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany, their cooperation masked deep ideological differences. The United States embraced democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, pursued a vision of communism and authoritarian control. And the two sides are going to be diametrically opposed to each other when it comes down to these ideologies. Now, the tensions are going to start to emerge in the waning days of World War II at the Yalta Conference and then at the Potsdam Conference, both of which were in 1945. At Yalta, President Franklin Roosevelt was there, one of his last public appearances. He dies shortly thereafter. And then at Potsdam, we have a new president, Harry Truman, who really hadn't been president for very long in the waning days of World War II. Allied leaders are going to debate the future of post-war Europe. The Soviet Union sought to expand its influence all over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, Eastern Germany. And in contrast, the United States was calling for free elections, self-determination, let the people decide for themselves what kind of government that they are going to have, whether they elect their leaders or not. We see the Soviet Union and their expansion as a threat to global stability as well. So that's kind of what comes out of Potsdam. Potsdam is also going to see the division of Germany itself. Berlin is going to be divided into sectors. East and West Germany are going to be established as well. And then, of course, different allies will be given charge of different parts. Now, with the Soviet Union expanding its influence, the United States will adopt a strategy of containment, or adopted a strategy of containment, aimed at stopping the spread of communism. And this policy was first articulated by Harry S. Truman, President Truman, in 1947, when he announced the Truman Doctrine. Now, containment is going to be the brainchild of George Kennan. Now, George Kennan was an American ambassador, or at least he worked in the diplomatic mission in Europe and in Russia. He understood the Soviet mind, and he basically says that communism that doesn't expand dies. So what do we need to do? Rather than destroy it where it is, keep it from going where it is not. And that's going to be the heart of the idea of containment. Help countries that do not want to become communist or that are leaning toward communists see that that's not the best way for them and help them financially, sometimes militarily, and others. And that's what the Truman Doctrine is about. The Truman Doctrine specifically deals with Greece and Turkey. So the Truman Doctrine is going to commit the U.S. to providing economic and military aid to countries threatened by communism. As mentioned, Greece and Turkey are on the top of that list. And it marked a significant shift in the United States foreign policy because as the nation takes on a more active role in global affairs to counter the Soviet Union, we are going to start to step into that position of world power. We're going to be very influential around the world. Now, another major part of U.S. strategy is going to be the Marshall Plan, or was the Marshall Plan. It's a massive economic aid program. It's designed to rebuild Western Europe after the devastation of World War II. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States will provide over $13 billion to help restore European economies, strengthen the democratic governments, and to prevent the spread of communism, or at least try to assist in stopping the spread of communism. And it's a huge success. It helped to stabilize Europe. It helped to foster closer political and economic ties between the United States and Western Europe. But the Soviet Union saw it as an American attempt to assert dominance, and that's going to further deepen the Cold War tensions. And let me just kind of throw this out there too. I believe one reason that the Marshall Plan does in fact go into place is because we hadn't done this at the end of World War I, and we saw what happened there. The rise of a depression in Germany and Hitler coming along to say, listen, I can get you out of this depression if you just do what I tell you to. So again, it was an attempt to overcome, in my mind, some of the mistakes we had made before. Why do we study history? To learn from the past. Now, one of the first major Cold War confrontations will occur at Berlin. And after the war, Germany was divided into these zones by the Allies. The Soviet Union was holding the eastern part of Berlin and the eastern part of Germany. The United States, Britain, and France controlled the western portions of both Berlin and Germany. And this was set up at those conferences mentioned before, at Potsdam, for example. In 1948, the Soviets, though, in an attempt to cut off the West Berlin from the Allies that were supporting that city, the Soviets are going to blockade all land routes into the city. We call this the Berlin Blockade. Now, in response, the U.S. and its allies are going to organize the Berlin Airlift. Berlin, West Berlin, is this sort of sea of democracy in the middle of a red communist country. That's what East Germany was at the time. And so the Allies are going to deliver food, fuel, supplies, and whatever else the city needed to stay alive by air. And this is going to go for months, like 15 months if memory serves. It's going to show the world that the U.S. is committed to defending democracy and the opposition of Soviet aggression. The blockade would eventually be lifted, but the division of Berlin would remain a symbol of the Cold War tensions for decades. Now, we don't have a Berlin Wall yet. That goes up in the early 1960s, but all of these events are somewhat connected because we are moving on through this Cold War discussion. Now, the Cold War would turn hot in 1950. This is when North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China as well, will invade South Korea. The United States, under a banner of the United Nations, because the new United Nations, which had come in there, it established both the Security Council and also the General Assembly. Well, they're going to make decisions when we have major issues like this. It's another reason why the United States really hasn't declared war since, 1942? Because Korea was not an American war. In theory, technically, it's a United Nations police action. But the United Nations, with the United States comprising 80 to 90% of the forces involved, is going to intervene to defend South Korea, marking the beginning of the Korean War. Now, the war is going to rage on for 3 years. It's going to end in a stalemate, and the Korean Peninsula will be divided along the 38th parallel. The Korean War would reinforce the global nature of the Cold War, and it also demonstrates that both sides are willing to use military force in order to protect their interests. Now, the Cold War didn't just affect foreign policy. It also had a profound impact on American society as well, because as we are going head-to-head with communism, we start to fear that communism has potentially infiltrated American politics and culture. And we saw this in the early part of the 1920s as well, what we call the first Red Scare. Well, now this is the second Red Scare. Have communists got into the movies? Have they got into our popular culture? Have they? Are there members of Congress or members of the federal government that are secretly closet communists? Senator Joseph McCarthy is going to become infamous for his aggressive investigations into alleged communist infiltration of the United States government. It's going to lead to widespread paranoia and the persecution of suspected communists. But, McCarthy is not the first to really be involved in this. In the later part of the 1940s, we're going to start to see people looking at the movie industries with the House Un-American Affairs Committee. So again, it's a bigger issue than simply Joseph McCarthy. He just sort of becomes the most well-known figure of this particular chapter. So the early years of the Cold War are going to set the stage for a global conflict that would shape American foreign and domestic policy for decades. Now, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Crisis, the Korean War, figures like George Kennan and his long telegram, the United States is going to take on a leadership role in the fight against communism. And while the Soviet Union sought to expand its influence in Eastern Europe and beyond, we are going to sort of be a bulwark against that. Now, though the Cold War didn't involve any direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the rivalry would create a world of proxy wars, of which Korea was one. Also, espionage, political maneuvering. The Cold War gives us stories like James Bond. And so this just is scratching the surface. So if you want to dig deeper into this, there are universities out there that teach whole classes on nothing but the Cold War, and I've taken one or two of those myself in my past. So thanks for joining me on this exploration of chapter 25. Don't forget to like this if it's been helpful. Just give me a thumbs up so I know. If you want to comment and tell me something, that's fine. But check out our next chapters. We continue to go through the Cold War, and we start talking about some domestic issues as well. And we'll start digging a little deeper into it and move beyond simply where it all begins. All right, you guys take care. Good luck on your exams, and I'll see you down the road.